There is a moment in every legend's life when the world finally stops and stares, not in awe, not in applause, but in the quiet, breathless recognition that something irreplaceable is about to end. For Harrison Ford, that moment came not on a battlefield, not in the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon, not in the shadow of a crumbling temple. It came under the blinding lights of a press conference in front of cameras that had followed him for half a century, when a single question broke through every wall he had ever built. Is this really the last time? And Harrison Ford, the man who had outrun boulders, defeated empires, and survived more on-screen disasters than any actor in Hollywood history, could not answer. His voice cracked, his eyes filled, and for a moment, the most stoic face in cinema simply broke. He was 80 years old, and the world was watching him say goodbye. But here is what the cameras did not show. Behind that farewell lay 8 decades of a life that was never supposed to look like this. A carpenter who was told he had no future in film. A man who rebuilt himself from silence and rejection more times than anyone remembers. A legend who carried not just iconic roles, but invisible wounds. A body pushed beyond its limits. A mind that wrestled with darkness in the years when no spotlight found him. At 83, Harrison Ford is still here, still working, still refusing to disappear. But the story behind the legend, the real one, is not about Han Solo or Indiana Jones. It is about the man underneath the hat. Before we go further, did Harrison Ford's farewell to Indiana Jones move you? Drop a comment below. And if you've followed his journey for years, leave a like. This story is for you. The story of Harrison Ford does not begin with applause. It begins with silence. The particular kind of silence that settles over a life when the world has already decided you do not belong. Born on July 13, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, Harrison Ford arrived into a family held together more by routine than by warmth. His father, Christopher Ford, was an advertising executive of Irish Catholic descent, a man of quiet discipline who measured the world in practicality. His mother, Dorothy, a former radio actress of Russian Jewish heritage, carried the ghost of a creative life she had set aside for domesticity. Between them, young Harrison learned early that dreams were things other people talked about. In his house, you worked, you endured, you did not complain. School offered no comfort. At Maine Township High School in Park Ridge, Harrison was neither remarkable nor remembered. Not the star athlete, not the class president, not the boy the teachers pointed to as an example. He was, by his own later admission, profoundly unremarkable. Quiet in the way that is often mistaken for contentment, but is actually the silence of someone who has not yet found a single place where he fits. It was almost by accident that he wandered into a drama class during his final year at Ripon College in Wisconsin. Not out of passion, not out of vision, simply because it was there. And something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a door opens in a dark hallway and light falls across a face that had almost forgotten what warmth felt like. He moved to Los Angeles in 1964 with a young wife, Mary Marquardt, a modest sum of money, and the fragile, irrational belief that cinema had room for him. It did not take long for the city to disagree. Audition after audition ended in rejection. Casting directors looked past him. Producers forgot his name before he reached the door. Columbia Pictures signed him to a small contract, then dropped him without ceremony. Universal did the same. He was told, more than once, in the particular cruelty that Hollywood reserves for the hopeful, that he simply did not have it, that his face was not interesting enough. that his presence did not command attention. Have you ever been told you were not enough at something you knew, deep down, was meant for you? Drop your answer in the comments. You might be more like Harrison Ford than you think. He was in his mid-20s with a wife, and soon 2 small sons, Ben and Willard, depending on him. And Hollywood had already written its verdict, so Harrison Ford picked up a hammer. Carpentry was not a romantic choice. It was a survival choice. He taught himself through books and through the unforgiving education of ruined wood and wasted hours, and slowly, stubbornly, he became good at it. He built cabinets. He renovated homes. He installed doors for the same industry executives who had dismissed him in waiting rooms. There is a particular humiliation in that, in carrying your tools into the house of the man who told you that you were not enough, and building something beautiful for him anyway. Here is a question. If Hollywood had shut every door in your face, would you have kept going or moved on? Team keep fighting or team move on? Tell us below. But Ford did not carry bitterness into those rooms. He carried precision. He carried the same quiet stubbornness that had kept him in drama class when instinct told him to leave. He told himself that carpentry was temporary, that it was the bridge, not the destination. And he kept auditioning, kept showing up, kept refusing to accept that the verdict was final. Those were lean, grinding years. Money was tight. Confidence was thinner. Mary held the household together, while Harrison moved between job sites and casting calls, carrying sawdust on his boots into rooms that smelled of ambition and cigarette smoke. His sons grew. His marriage strained under the weight of a dream that showed no signs of arriving. And still, he did not stop. Because the boy who had grown up in quiet rooms that did not celebrate him had learned one thing above all others, that the only verdict that truly counted was the one he gave himself. Stay with us, because what happens next is the moment nobody saw coming. The door that changed everything did not open in a casting room. It opened on a movie set, where Harrison Ford was simply trying to fix a cabinet. What do you think happened? Keep watching. The door that changed Harrison Ford's life did not open because he was the most talented man in the room. It opened because he was the most persistent one, and because fate, when it finally arrives, rarely announces itself. In 1973, Ford was hired to install a door at the offices of casting director Fred Roos. He was 30 years old, carrying sawdust on his boots, invisible in the way he had learned to be. George Lucas was inside, conducting auditions for a small film called American Graffiti. Roos, who had seen something in Ford that Hollywood had repeatedly dismissed, suggested Lucas give him a read. Lucas was reluctant. Ford read anyway. He got the part, a small role, barely a footnote. But it placed him inside the orbit of a director who was quietly assembling something much larger. 4 years later, in 1977, that something larger had a name: Star Wars. When Star Wars opened on May 25, 1977, it did not simply become a hit. It became a cultural earthquake, and Harrison Ford, the carpenter who had been told his face was not interesting enough, was suddenly Han Solo. Cocky, magnetic, dangerously charming. The kind of character the audience did not just watch, but wanted to be. Overnight, the Invisible Man became impossible to ignore. But here is what the celebrations missed. Behind the grin of Han Solo was a man deeply uncomfortable with what was happening to him. Ford had not chased fame. He had chased craft. And suddenly, fame arrived not in a trickle, but in a flood. and it brought with it something he had never prepared for: the loss of ordinary life. He could no longer walk into a grocery store without being recognized, could no longer sit in a park with his sons without cameras appearing. The privacy he had taken for granted during the carpenter years, the quiet anonymity of a man carrying tools through the back doors of other people's lives, was gone. Permanently. Irreversibly. Think about this for a moment. Would you trade your privacy forever for that level of fame? There is no right answer, but tell us in the comments, because Harrison Ford's answer might surprise you. And then, in 1981, came Indiana Jones. If Han Solo had made him a star, Indiana Jones made him a myth. Raiders of the Lost Ark was not simply a film. It was the creation of an archetype, the rugged, brilliant, deeply human adventurer who bled and stumbled and still somehow always found a way forward. Audiences did not just love Indiana Jones, they believed in him, and they projected that belief onto the man behind the hat. Harrison Ford was now carrying two of the most iconic characters in cinema history on his shoulders. And the weight, though invisible on screen, was crushing in private. His marriage to Mary Marquardt, already strained by years of financial uncertainty and competing priorities, collapsed under the pressure of superstardom. They divorced in 1979. Ford later admitted the guilt of that failure never fully left him. The boys, Ben and Willard, grew up in the fractured landscape of a family that fame had not protected, but had in many ways accelerated the breaking of. He found companionship with screenwriter Melissa Matheson, whom he married in 1983. They had two children together, Malcolm and Georgia. For a time, the new family brought stability, but the pattern of absence that fame demands, the endless shoots in distant locations, the months away, the exhaustion that returns home like a stranger wearing a familiar face, began to erode that foundation too. Here is something worth asking yourself. Can a man be a legend on screen and fully present at home at the same time? Harrison Ford tried, and the answer he found was more painful than any role he ever played. Keep watching. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Ford built one of the most remarkable filmographies in Hollywood history. The Empire Strikes Back, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones, and The Temple of Doom. Witness, which earned him his only Academy Award nomination. The Mosquito Coast, Working Girl, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Presumed Innocent, The Fugitive, Air Force One, film after film, hit after hit, a relentless machine of production that generated billions and left almost no room for the man inside it to breathe. Those who worked with him during this era describe a professional of extraordinary dedication and an almost intimidating emotional self-containment. He did not seek approval on set. He did not linger at parties. He did not court the press or cultivate the mythology surrounding him. He showed up, did the work, and went home. But home, by then, was a complicated word. Because the boy who had once been invisible had become so visible that he could no longer see himself clearly. And somewhere beneath the global icon, beneath Han Solo and Indiana Jones and Jack Ryan and all the rest, a quieter, more fragile man was searching for something that no amount of box office success had ever delivered. A place where he simply belonged. We are about to enter the chapter Harrison Ford almost did not survive. Not on screen. In real life. Stay with us. Because what comes next is the part of his story that almost never got told. There is a particular kind of suffering that fame cannot shield you from. Not the suffering of poverty or rejection. Harrison Ford had already survived both of those. But the suffering that arrives when you are standing at the absolute peak of everything you ever wanted, and you still cannot find peace. By the early 1990s, Harrison Ford was the highest-grossing actor in Hollywood history. His films had collectively earned billions. His name alone could greenlight a production, and yet, in the quiet hours between shoots, in the silences that fame fills with noise but never with meaning, something was breaking down. He would later speak with rare, careful honesty about a period of deep depression that shadowed his peak years. Not the kind that announces itself with dramatic collapse, but the slow, grinding kind that simply empties a man of color. The kind that makes the ordinary feel impossible, and the extraordinary feel pointless. He described it as a fog, a persistent, disorienting fog that no amount of success could burn away. Therapy helped. Slowly. Reluctantly. Ford was not a man who surrendered easily to vulnerability, either on screen or off. But the depression forced a reckoning he could not outrun. It demanded that he look at the life he had constructed and ask honestly whether the man inside it was surviving or simply performing survival. Has there ever been a moment in your life when everything looked fine from the outside but felt completely hollow on the inside? You don't have to answer that publicly, but hold that feeling. Because what Harrison Ford did with his is the reason this story matters. And then the body began to speak. In 1993, while filming The Fugitive, Ford injured his knee during a grueling chase sequence. It was the first loud signal from a body that had been absorbing punishment for decades, falls, stunts, physical demands that most actors delegated to doubles, but Ford, characteristically, insisted on performing himself. He wore the injuries like a private code of honor, proof that he was not simply playing the hero. He was willing to bleed for it. But the knees remembered. The back remembered. The body, unlike the myth, does not forget. Then came March 5, 2015, a day that came within minutes of ending everything. Ford was piloting his vintage Ryan PT-22 Recruit aircraft, a plane he had owned and loved for years, when the engine failed shortly after takeoff from Santa Monica Airport. He had seconds to make a decision. With no runway available, he brought the plane down on Penmar Golf Course, a controlled crash that saved the lives of everyone around him and very nearly ended his own. The impact was violent. Ford suffered a broken pelvis, a broken ankle, a broken arm, and severe lacerations to his head. Emergency crews found him conscious but critically injured, trapped in the wreckage of the cockpit. He was airlifted to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center, where surgeons worked for hours to stabilize him. He was 72 years old. Imagine being 72 years old, lying in the wreckage of a plane you just crashed, and your first thought is whether you will ever work again. That is exactly what Harrison Ford admitted thinking. What would your first thought have been? Tell us below. The recovery was long, painful, and humbling in the way that only physical catastrophe can humble a man who has built his identity around physical capability. Ford spent months in rehabilitation, relearning movements that his body had performed automatically for 7 decades. Every step was a negotiation. Every morning, a reminder of how completely fate can rewrite a life in a single second. Those close to him during that period describe a man shaken not just physically, but existentially. The plane crash forced a confrontation with mortality that even decades of on-screen near-death experiences had not prepared him for. This was not Indiana Jones escaping a temple. This was Harrison Ford lying on a golf course, wondering if he would ever stand up again. And yet, characteristically, he refused to disappear. Within months, he was back on set, filming Star Wars, The Force Awakens. Reprising Han Solo at 73, after a gap of 32 years, with a broken body still knitting itself back together, and a spirit that the crash had somehow, paradoxically, clarified rather than diminished. But the body had one more bill to present. During the production of The Force Awakens, a hydraulic door on the Millennium Falcon set malfunctioned and slammed into Ford, breaking his leg and pinning him to the ground. The crew was horrified. Ford, characteristically, was more concerned about the production schedule than his own condition. Two major physical catastrophes within months of each other. A body that had given everything to the myth of Harrison Ford was now demanding something in return. And quietly, in the spaces between surgeries and rehabilitation sessions, between the public performances of resilience and the private reckonings of a man facing the final chapters of his physical life, something began to shift. The fog of depression that had haunted his peak years had not disappeared. But it had changed shape. It was no longer the hollow emptiness of a man surrounded by success and starved of meaning. It had become something harder and stranger and ultimately more useful. It had become clarity. Stay with us, because the next chapter is where Harrison Ford stops running from the things that hurt him and finally turns around to face them. And what he finds when he does will change the way you see him completely. There are men who find redemption in grand gestures, in public declarations and dramatic reinventions staged for the benefit of an audience. And then there are men who find it quietly, in the ordinary rituals of a life finally chosen rather than simply endured. Harrison Ford found his in the second kind. By the late 1990s, his marriage to Melissa Matheson was fracturing under the familiar weight of absence and incompatibility. They separated in 2001 and finalized their divorce in 2004, a process made painful not just by the personal failure it represented, but by the financial settlement that followed, reported at the time as one of the largest in Hollywood history. Ford later spoke of the end of that marriage with the measured grief of a man who understood his own role in its collapse. No excuses, no deflection, just the quiet acknowledgement that he had not always been present when presence was what mattered most. He was in his late 50s, twice divorced, 4 children distributed across 2 broken families, a body beginning to register decades of physical punishment, and a career that, despite its extraordinary dimensions, had left him with the persistent, uncomfortable sense that the most important things in his life had somehow happened off stage. And then he met Callista Flockhart. Here is something to think about. Do you believe it is possible to find real love after 60? After 2 failed marriages and a lifetime of putting work first? Harrison Ford did. And the way it happened is not what you would expect. They met at the 2002 Golden Globe Awards. Ford was 60 years old. Flockhart, best known for her role in Ally McBeal, was 37. The encounter was unremarkable on the surface. A party, an introduction, a conversation that neither of them had planned for. But something held. Something that all the carefully managed relationships of his Hollywood years had never quite produced. Honesty. Simplicity. The particular ease of 2 people who have both been through enough to stop performing for each other. Flockhart had adopted a son, Liam, as a single mother in 2001. And Harrison Ford, the man who had carried the guilt of intermittent fatherhood through 2 marriages, found himself stepping into a role he had never fully occupied before. Not the absentee star racing between continents, not the mythological figure too large for ordinary life, but simply a father, present, consistent, there. He later described it as the most important performance of his life. Except, It was not a performance at all. It was, for perhaps the first time, simply real. Ford and Flockhart married in 2010, in a quiet ceremony in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with Liam beside them. Those who attended described it as the most relaxed they had ever seen Harrison Ford. The guardedness that had defined his public presence for decades was, if not gone, at least lowered. He laughed easily. He held Callista's hand without calculation. He looked, one guest recalled, like a man who had finally stopped waiting for something bad to happen. What do you think changed in Harrison Ford that allowed him to finally let someone in after so many years of walls? Drop your thoughts below. Sometimes the comments on this channel are more insightful than anything we could write. The years that followed were the quietest of his public life and, by every account, the richest of his private one. He and Callista settled into a life divided between their ranch in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and their home in Los Angeles. He learned, slowly and imperfectly, the rhythms of domestic presence, school runs, family dinners, the small, unremarkable ceremonies of a life lived at human scale rather than Hollywood scale. He spoke in interviews during this period with a directness that surprised journalists accustomed to his famous reticence. About therapy, about the depression that had shadowed his peak years, about the mistakes he had made as a father and a husband, about the particular loneliness of being one of the most recognized faces on the planet, and still feeling fundamentally unknown. He was not performing vulnerability. He was simply, finally, done pretending it did not exist. His relationship with his older children, Ben and Willard from his first marriage, and Malcolm and Georgia from his second, deepened during these years. The distance that fame and absence had created did not disappear, but it narrowed. Ford made the effort, showed up, acknowledged the cost of his choices without drowning in them. And with Liam, the boy who had not been born into his legend but had simply grown up beside it, he found something unexpected. The chance to do it differently. To be the father he had not always managed to be. To trade the myth for the man. Those who knew him during this period consistently described the same transformation. A softening, not weakness, not diminishment, but the particular grace of a man who has stopped fighting the parts of himself he cannot control and started tending to the parts that matter. The carpenter had finally built something that would last. We are almost at the final chapter, and it is the one that will stay with you longest. Because it is not about a film or a role or a record broken. It is about an 83-year-old man standing at the edge of everything he built and asking himself one quiet question. Stay with us. There is a particular kind of courage that has nothing to do with outrunning boulders or escaping villains or pulling a damaged plane out of the sky. It is the courage of a man who has spent 80 years building a legend and finally, quietly, chooses to set it down. Harrison Ford set it down in the summer of 2023. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny was not simply a film. It was a farewell. A deliberate, carefully constructed goodbye to the character that had defined not just his career, but the dreams of an entire generation. Ford knew it going in. The cast knew it. The crew knew it. And when the cameras finally stopped rolling, when the last scene was filmed and the hat was placed on the table for what everyone understood was the last time, something irreplaceable passed out of the world. At the Cannes Film Festival premiere, Harrison Ford stood on that legendary stage and wept, not the polite, camera-aware tears of a practiced performer. Real tears, the kind that arrive without permission and cannot be managed or explained away. The audience rose to give him a 5-minute standing ovation, and Ford, the the most self-contained man in Hollywood. The man who had spent 6 decades building walls against exactly this kind of exposure simply stood there and let them see him. He was 80 years old, and he was saying goodbye. When you watched that moment at Cannes, what did you feel? Because millions of people around the world felt something they could not quite name. Drop one word in the comments that describes it. Just one word. Let's see what this community feels together. But the farewell was not only cinematic, it was physical. It was existential. Because by the time Dial of Destiny reached theaters, Harrison Ford's body was carrying the full accumulated weight of everything it had absorbed over 8 decades. The spine that had been compressed and strained through decades of insisting on performing his own stunts. The knee injured on The Fugitive. The pelvis, ankle, and arm broken in the 2015 plane crash. The leg shattered by the Millennium Falcon door. And now, layered over all of it, the quiet, daily indignities of a body at 83 navigating a world designed for younger men. In August 2024, Ford appeared at the Disney D23 Expo. Fans who had followed him for decades watched with undisguised concern as he moved carefully, deliberately, with the particular caution of someone who has learned through pain exactly what the body will and will not forgive. Speculation spread across social media. Rumors multiplied. The word Parkinson's appeared in headlines, repeated with the breathless certainty of people who had not checked their facts. It was not Parkinson's. That was confirmed clearly and definitively. But the concern was not entirely misplaced, because Harrison Ford at 83 is not the man who once hung from the side of a moving truck or dragged himself through the desert with a broken shoulder. He is something more complicated than that. More interesting. More human. Here is an honest question. Does it change the way you see a legend when you see them age? Does vulnerability make them more or less extraordinary in your eyes? Think about that, because Harrison Ford's answer to that question is written in the way he has chosen to live these final chapters. In early 2025, Ford was diagnosed with herpes zoster, shingles, a viral reactivation that strikes hardest at those whose immune systems have absorbed decades of stress and physical punishment. It is painful, it is exhausting, and it forced him to withdraw from the Academy Awards ceremony, an absence that sent quiet ripples through an industry that had grown accustomed to his presence as a kind of permanent fixture. He did not make a dramatic announcement. He did not seek sympathy. He simply, quietly, was not there, and the empty space he left was its own kind of statement. At home, in the mornings before the world demands anything of him, Harrison Ford begins each day with slow, careful Pilates routines prescribed by therapists to protect a spine that still punishes him with stiffness and occasional flares of pain. His diet is meticulous. Fish, vegetables, no red meat, no dairy. Every meal a deliberate choice between healing and hurting. His vision requires constant glasses now. Stage lights, decades of them, and the lingering neurological effects of physical trauma have taken their toll. He has confided to those closest to him that the thought of one day being unable to see Liam's face clearly, or Callista's, frightens him more than any headline or rumor ever could. And yet, every evening, in the house in Los Angeles, or on the ranch in Wyoming where the sky is wide and the silence is the good kind, Harrison Ford is present, fully, deliberately, stubbornly present. Dinner at the table. Conversations that do not involve scripts or box office projections. The ordinary miracle of a man who spent decades outrunning his own life, finally choosing to inhabit it. His fortune, estimated at over $300 million, sits in portfolios and properties and the quiet accumulation of a career without parallel. But Ford speaks of it with the detachment of a man who learned long ago that money is a poor answer to the questions that actually matter. He has indicated that his estate will prioritize Callista and Liam, and that significant portions will flow toward causes he has championed for decades: environmental conservation, indigenous land rights, the protection of wild spaces that Hollywood money can either destroy or preserve, depending on the conscience of the people who hold it. He does not want to be remembered for Han Solo. He does not want to be remembered for Indiana Jones. He wants, if he is remembered at all, to be remembered as a man who showed up, who kept going when the world told him to stop, who found, after 80 years of searching, that the most heroic thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear. And now the question that matters most: what will you take from Harrison Ford's story? The persistence through rejection? The courage to rebuild after collapse? The grace of finally slowing down without stopping? Tell us below. Because your answer says something true about who you are and what you are still reaching for. The hat is on the table. The whip is coiled and still. The man who carried them for 40 years is sitting quietly in a house filled with the sounds of ordinary life, and he is, by every account, at peace. Not because everything worked out perfectly. It did not. Not because the body cooperated, or the marriages all held, or the losses were manageable. They were not. But because Harrison Ford, the carpenter who became a legend, the invisible man who became impossible to ignore, the broken man who kept building, finally understood the truth that his whole life had been trying to teach him: that the greatest adventure was never on the screen. It was the one he almost missed while he was busy becoming a myth. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel. Because every week, we bring you the untold chapters of the lives that shaped the world. The real stories. The ones behind the legend. And if Harrison Ford's journey reminded you of something worth fighting for, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. One last question. If you could say one thing directly to Harrison Ford right now, what would it be? Leave it in the comments. He may never read it, but someone else who needs those words will.